Yes.
My Lord, can I deal with two things I was asked, in fact, both by my Lord Justice Nugee. Firstly, the C equals 16 problem. We agree that it also occurs when C equals 2, 4, and 8. I wanted to check. It was just that it's at trial C equals 16 was the one that we discussed. On the judge's findings, the skilled person would have, in due course, have realised that problem with the Ericsson function, and it just underlines the black mark against the modular arithmetic aspect of the Ericsson function, which makes it unrealistic to bank that or treat that as a fixed thing that you're not going to consider changing. The second thing was, I was asked about the papers relating to stolen from NRC2. So can I hand up 3 pages from the trial bundle?
Yes, I mean, it's a slightly tongue-in-cheek use of the word stolen, given that it's a public domain source, which is published for that very purpose, that people should use the recipes.
Quite so. So stolen, I don't rely on in its pejorative sense. I just mean used off, taken off the shelf.
Yes.
That is my point, and of course you've got that. Your Lordship has that. So let me tell you what you've got. So you see in red the trial bundle references. So if I refer to the trial bundle references, so E1 page 4, the first page, I've written the date 19th of November 1999 on it. This was a proposal, as you can see, for dealing with the timing of idle periods in the physical layer. And this was a proposal by Nokia for how to deal with that particular issue. And if you look, it's pretty much halfway down the page, you'll see that rand x is defined, and it's 106 times rand x minus 1 plus 12, 1, 2, 3, 8. And then the percentage sign means mod, so mod 6075. And underneath it says values stolen from numerical recipes in C, by which they mean values taken off the shelf from numerical recipes in C. The next page, D2, page 43, is the relevant page from numerical recipes in C. Now, I cannot stress this enough. This is the second edition of NRC. So I've written, that's my handwriting, NRC2 from 1992 at the top. At that stage, they were saying that LCGs might be usable. And there was this table, constants for quick and dirty random number generators. And there's no dispute about this, that the person at round 1 has just taken the first row of that table as their constants for their random number generator. IM is the modulus, IA is the multiplier, IC is the increment. So you see there that they have indeed taken it from NRC2, underline 2. And then just for completeness, the last bit, E1 page 49, you see section 8.3 is the calculation of the idle period position. And you can see the equation. We've actually highlighted it on the final page. There it is in the standard. Obviously, the standard doesn't have any commentary, but we know from the email that I showed you on the first page.
So you've highlighted it on the final page?
Yes.
Which page is that?
E1 page 50.
I don't have 50. Oh, sorry, it's on the back. It's double-sided.
Sorry.
No problem. Okay, I got there in the end.
E1 page 50, that's it. The date, you can see the date, it's March 2000. I think this is the first version of the standard that had this equation in it, March 2000. That's the date in the top right-hand corner.
And this is what, 3G or 4G?
Looks like 3G.
This is 3G.
Yeah, it's released 1999.
Yes, released 1999. Yeah. And so that was my point was that was the one example of a random number generator being used in the standard, and it was taken off the shelf.
I think that's why I asked. What was behind my question was I hadn't expected this to be a 3G document. We were talking about the standard, and I've never heard someone who was talking about a case about, say, standard 4G, then referring to another standard which is different, without making that clear.
Mea culpa. So that's NRC2, and we're now. My next topic is going to address NRC3. So it's important one gets those differences in my mind. So I'm now addressing steps 5 and 6 of our list. 5 and 6, we've put them as separate ones. I'm not suggesting that they're really separate steps. It's just convenient to do with them as 2 sentences or paragraphs. So steps 5 and 6, and this is ground of appeal 5. And this is the skilled person discovering LCGs in the literature and deciding to use one in their function. And of course, we've already seen that LCGs were not CGK. So this is how they we're looking at a skilled person coming across LCGs for the first time. And we need to be precise about about Apple's case, which the judge accepted. So that's the judgment, core bundles, tab 6. Page 110. Oh, 109 starts. So it's the heading at the bottom 109 is getting to Nuth. Apple's key point was that by one means or another, having embarked on literature search, the skilled person would find their way to Nuth. And he accepts this. He says it's a standard reference work, and it's possible that they might find it by asking a librarian. But the case that he accepted was built on the skilled person taking either Wikipedia as a jumping off point or using NRC and getting to Nuth that way. Now, in relation to Wikipedia, the judge accepted that the skilled person would not use Wikipedia as a sole source. That's 239. So NRC was an essential building block of the case to get to Nuth.
Don't understand that because what is said in 239 was wouldn't use Wikipedia as a sole source, but it was a useful starting point for finding something reliable, and there's a clear pointer to Nuth in it. So, in other words, there's two paths, one via Wikipedia and one via NRC, and they both lead to Nuth. That's as I read it at the moment.
Yeah, I understand that. You have to read that with the first sentence of 239. He says, for these, I'm about to show you 237 and 238, but in 239 it says, for these reasons, I think the CGK attitude to LCGs must be assessed from NRC, Nuth, and to a significantly lesser extent, Wikipedia. Because
Wikipedia in itself would not be regarded as reliable.
Indeed, but he does say must be assessed from NRC and Nuth, and to a significantly lesser extent, Wikipedia. He didn't accept a case. Well, the case wasn't advanced, and nor did he accept a case that you get to Nuth without going via NRC. So there was no suggestion that you can get there without going via NRC, and the judge didn't attempt to say that you get there just.
All right, but does it matter? Because either way, you end up at Nuth, isn't that the point?
But no, it matters because you end up at Nuth via NRC 3. That's the crucial.
You want to
thing.
rely on all the nasty things that NRC says about LCGs before you get to Nuth. That's the point.
Yes.
That's the forensic purpose of this.
Yes, but it is the case that was presented to the judge and accepted by the judge. It isn't me just trying to say, hey, before you please look at NRC 3. The route to Nuth, accepted by the judge, did go via NRC 3. And the judge dealt with it on that basis.
But has he excluded, I appreciate what you emphasise the word significantly lesser extent, but has he excluded the route via Wikipedia?
Yes, in paragraph 239 in the first sentence, or the first two sentences together. And indeed, the rest of the judgment wouldn't make sense because he would have said, in addition to these reasons for downplaying NRC, in any event, the case works going directly from Wikipedia to Nuth as well. Yeah, and if you look at 236 as well.
Well, yeah, that's because that's what Professor Lozana himself did.
Sure, but as I said...
But look at 248 and 249, where Wikipedia comes back in.
Yeah, absolutely. But 249 is disagreeing with any of NRC, any of them was CGK, which obviously he rejected. He accepted that NRC was CGK in the sense that you would go to NRC. And And then 2480 says supported by NRC and NUTH, and Wikipedia for what it's worth is that LCGs were very well known. And really the key point is that if he was accepting a case that didn't go via NRC3, he would have said, in any case, if you don't go via NRC3, none of this problem arises. And he said, and the first sentence of 239 says the opposite. He says the CGK attitude must be assessed from NRC.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to understand is what your submission is as to what analytically is going on here.
Yeah. So,
and it's not necessarily your fault. Maybe the judge's fault. I don't know. But one way of analysing this is that what the judge is doing is trying to ascertain what the common general knowledge is, and there are various different sources for common general knowledge. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is these sources are not necessarily all common general knowledge. Maybe some of them are, maybe some of them aren't. But it comes back to the question of a literature search. And the point about that is it doesn't necessarily matter if they're common general knowledge, because if it's obvious to do a literature search and obvious to follow through what you find on the literature search, it doesn't matter that what the information you find in that way wasn't common general knowledge to start with.
no, indeed. So the answer to that is this. He definitely found that NRC, the correct version, was CGK. It was Professor Lozano's evidence was that it was a primary reference, and he accepted that.
So remind us, where do we find that?
That is yeah. Yes, there's no doubt that, yes, I've no doubt that CGK will usually include the latest edition of established standard works, and in this case, that's NRC3. And in any case, he was saying that you would use NRC3 on the literature search. And then, just to make a point up the good that I made a moment ago, at the beginning of paragraph 251, the judge says, the potentially very large but in Apple's way lies in the comments in NRC that LCGs were actually poor, or even poor random number generators should not be used on their own. And he doesn't say an answer to this is, well, if you go via Wikipedia, you don't see, you don't have to worry about that. On the contrary, he has, as he has said at 239, he has to assess the CGK attitude involving it by using NRC3.
Well, but this is precisely why I asked the question. I mean, I'm struggling with this because on the one hand, there seems to be a logic that involves going to Wikipedia and then to NUTH, in which case you don't take into account NRC. And then there's a logic that depends on going from NRC to NUTH, in which case you don't bother with what's in Wikipedia.
Indeed, and the judge definitely did not say that the pattern was obvious using the first of those two routes.
Could it perhaps be a different thing? That once the judge has found that the third edition of NRC is common general knowledge, it doesn't matter what the mechanism of your literature search is, whether you go on a hop and a skip from Wikipedia to NUTH or on a jump and a thing from NRC to NUTH, because either way, if NRC represents common general knowledge, then the court will have to grapple with the negative remarks in NRC no matter what the route is.
Indeed.
Is that what the judge was doing?
He was doing one of the two. He was either doing that, or he was doing, you have to go via NRC3 in any event, or possibly both, or possibly just, it's one of those two, therefore I have to deal with NRC3 in any event.
Well, his conclusions at the first sentence of 253, which includes that the skilled person's attitude to LCGs is that they were not of good enough randomness for demanding applications, which is the point that NRC, which is how he interprets what NRC 3 says.
Indeed, he doesn't get that from Knuth, certainly.
Nor from Wikipedia.
Well, Wikipedia does. You do get it from Wikipedia as well. I mean, Wikipedia is pretty down on them as well. Not as furious as NRC 3. It's pretty down on them too.
But Knuth was not found to be common general knowledge, as I understand it.
Correct. It was literature search material. Obviously, I'm going to attack the passage, the sentence my lawyer just referred to as a matter of construction and reading of NRC 3. Brilliant. Those, one way or another, the Apple can't get to Knuth without involvement of NRC 3, and the judge certainly treated the case in that way and assessed the case on the basis that the skilled person reading Knuth will also read NRC 3, either because it's a book they'd go to in any event, or because that was what led them to Knuth. So, and our criticism of our point...
At all events, what matters for your purposes, as I understand it, you say, A, there was a clear finding that NRC 3 is common general knowledge, and B, you rely upon that, because you say, if it's common general knowledge, therefore, the skilled person will be aware of the criticisms in NRC 3.
Yes, I mean, the skilled person didn't know about LCGs, so they didn't have that chapter in their mind, but they had NRC.
No, they find it when they look there.
Exactly.
It's common general knowledge in the sense that it's a source.
Exactly.
It's not what you have in your memory. It's like the rubber book in chemistry.
Yes, or Terrell.
Sorry?
Or Terrell.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So can I just be sure I've understood that?
Yes.
The skill, what he says in 238 is that Apple's case, which he evidently accepts, was that NRC was a CGK source. So the skilled person knows of the existence of NRC.
They've got it on their shelf.
They've got it on their shelf. Does that mean that whenever considering a problem, they would go and look at it? Or, I mean, they obviously don't know everything that's in it.
If it's relevant to their problem, yes, they will. You know, yes, having got to where we've got, so having done steps 1, 2, 3, and 4, then yes, on those, assuming they've steps 1, 2, and 4, in this case, they will look at the relevant chapter on NRC on random number generators, because they're doing a literature search on random number generators.
Okay.
So yes, it doesn't mean for every problem they're deemed to have reread NRC 3 for the purpose of that problem. But in this case, because they know NRC 3 has relevant material to this problem, they're deemed to have read it one way or another. So that's how NRC 3 comes into the case, and now we need to look at NRC 3. So that's in the supplemental bundle. Well, your lordships have read 237 and 238, which explain why Professor Lozano was considering NRC 2, and the judge said, no, you've got to consider this by reference to NRC 3. And that's obviously important because it has an impact on Professor Lozano's evidence that the judge had to keep in mind. So I'm in the supplemental bundle, tab 12. Page 100.
Just before you go to NRC, I think I would find it helpful if you could show us briefly the passage in Professor Lozano's first report, where he explains just the little bit about the literature search. So he pulled NRC off his shelf, and that took him to Knuth. Just that little passage.
Yes. So supplemental bundle tab 8. Two places. It's in two places. So paragraph 105 on page 106. This is just in the context of CGK. He's not dealing with obviousness. And at 105, he says random number is also the topic of numerical recipes in C. This book was a primary reference for the skilled person. Indeed, many engineers in the field that involved numerical work would have been a book that I would have first turned to as a reference to find information about this topic. So that's in the context of the CGK, and then in the context of obviousness, it's page 117, paragraph 211.
So he seems to have discussed Wikipedia first.
Yes.
So this all starts at 98, do I understand this correctly?
Yes.
A skilled person would, if they needed further information, look in Wikipedia and standard textbooks. So then he goes through what Wikipedia says and notes at 104 that it cites Knuth. And then the standard text, if you're not looking at Wikipedia, is NRC, and that comes in at 105, and then that way you get to Knuth as well. Have I understood it correctly?
Yes, I should also show you page 100, paragraph 36. Go-to sources.
Yeah.
I mean, I would suggest that in paragraph 98, just going back to paragraph 98 at the end, where he says, if they needed further information, look at Wikipedia and standard textbooks. Sorry, I'm going to.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
So on the judge's finding, you'd have to say, but you'd have to add in parentheses, but not Wikipedia alone. So that just emphasises that you would definitely look at the standard textbooks in addition to Wikipedia.
Okay, thank you.
So I was on page 145. I should just tell you some important points that we're going to try and get out of this when they come up. One is that the judge said that NRC's teaching about the deprecating LCGs was aimed at the more demanding applications. So one of the things I'm going to show you is that NRC's deprecation of LCGs is not limited to when you have a demanding application. The second thing I'm going to show you is this. The judge said that teaching about made points about long period length. And the point I'm going to show you is firstly that the teaching about long period length is mandatory teaching. It's not you need this length of period for a demanding application. And secondly, the deprecation of LCGs had nothing to do with period length. So it was not the case, which the judge, we'll see what the judge said about it, that LCGs were bad because their periods were not good.
Now, this is a really trivial question. I'm sorry, it just bugs me. Did the title of the book change between the second and the third edition?
Yes.
Right.
Good spot. My lord gets a prize. We haven't worked out what it is.
Because this one is NR, not NRC.
In fact, and in fact there was NRF, NRC++, NR or whatever, the second edition. So the second editions, there were a whole load of NRs. And then the third edition was just NR. So
right. Okay.
You're absolutely right. And I think the first edition was NRC. You went for and C alone. Okay, so we're on the chapter 7, random numbers. And let's start with the second paragraph. Well, the first paragraph is the sort of philosophical point that we discussed this morning, conceptually impossible. Nevertheless, practical computer random number generators are in common use. We will leave it to philosophers of the computer age to resolve the paradox in a deep way. See Knuth, chapter 3, section 3.5. So that was I drew your lordship's attention to 3.5 because that's the sort of philosophical section that's referred to. And they make the point in the rest of the paragraph that you use the phrase pseudo-random, while the word random is reserved for the output of an intrinsically random physical process, like the elapsed time between clicks of a Geiger counter. So, my lord, that would be a way in which one could generate truly random numbers. That's not something we have to worry about. Let me skip to the bottom of that page, the last paragraph. The pragmatic point of view is thus that the randomness is in the eye of the beholder or programmer. What is random enough for one application may not be random enough for another. So that's the first point where NRC 3 is clearly turning its mind to different levels of demandingness for applications. It's recognising you've got demanding and less demanding. Okay. And then they mention there's an accepted list of statistical tests, and at the very bottom, good random number generators pass all of these tests, or at least the user better be aware of any that they fail, so that he or she would be able to judge whether they're relevant to the case in hand. Again, recognising, you know, practically randomness might be good enough for some. Then there's a reference to Knuth. Note that in the footnote, it's a reference to Knuth chapter 3, especially 3.5. So
yeah, but it's the third edition, which is the one that you told us wasn't used. But
indeed, but
we assume for present purposes that there's no material difference.
Correct, my lord, and that was how the trial proceeded. And that was accepted on all sides. Be cautious from any source dated earlier than about 1995, since the field progressed enormously in the following decade. That's obviously relevant to the assessment of.
Well, that's why it's so paradoxical to be using the version of Knuth from as long ago as 1981. But
yeah,
here we go.
Well,
you've explained why, that's where we are.
That's where we are. So, then the heading uniform deviates. Uniform deviates are just random numbers that lie within a specified range, typically 0.0 to 1.0 for floating point numbers, or 0 to a much larger number for integers. Within the range, any one number is just as likely as any other. And then if I can jump down, to the next paragraph, the state of the art for generating uniform deviates has advanced considerably in the last decade, so that's 97 to 2007, and now begins to resemble a mature field. It is now reasonable to expect to get perfect deviates in no more than a dozen or so arithmetic or logical operations per deviate, and fast, good enough deviates in many fewer operations than that. So that's the second time that they're recognising that you might want perfect random numbers or just good enough random numbers, and they're addressing their minds to both demanding and less demanding applications. And they talk about how why things have advanced. Then this is the last paragraph. The greatest lurking danger for a user today is that many out-of-date and inferior methods remain in general use. Here are some of the traps to watch for. Never, and obviously we rely on the word never, use a generator principally based on a LCG or MLCG. We say more about this below. Now I'm going to explain the word principally in a moment, why it says principally. But it's not, it's never use a generator principally based on an LCG. Next bullet point, never use a generator with a period less than about 2 to the power 64, which is about 2 times 10 to the power 19, or any generator whose period is undisclosed. Never use a generator that warns against its low order bits as being completely random. That was good advice once, but now it indicates an obsolete algorithm, usually an LCG. So it used to be good advice to say, oh, be careful of the lower order bits of this. But now, if you see someone say that, you just got to keep away from that generator completely. And then at the top of 147, never use the built-in generators in C and C+ languages. And then they say that if all scientific papers whose results are in doubt because of one or more of the above traps were to disappear from library shelves, there will be a gap on each shelf about as big as your fist. You may also want to watch for indications that a generator is over-engineered and therefore wasteful of resources. So here, I think this is the third time now they are recognising demanding and undemanding applications, and here they are saying you don't want these very over-engineered ones. Avoid generators that take more than, say, 2 dozen arithmetic or logical operations to generate a 16-bit integer. Avoid using generators over-designed for serious cryptographic use. So we'll come back to this. They're saying that those really highly engineered ones for cryptographic use, that's not for us. Avoid using generators with a period greater than 10 to the 100. You really will never need it. And above some minimum bound, the period of generator has little to do with its quality. So they are specifically saying, there comes a point where the period doesn't need to be that long. And what they're saying in this bullet point is that there is some minimum bound above which you don't really need to worry about the period of the generator. And we can take it that that the minimum bound is about 2 to the 64, because that's what they've said is their minimum bound at the bottom of page 146. In any case, they're definitely considering the full range of applications, and they're saying this is the range for non-cryptographic applications of all sorts, at least 2 to the 64, but no, that's certainly not 10 to the 100. Since we've told you what to avoid from the past, we should immediately follow with the received wisdom of the present. And this is very striking because it's in a box to sort of emphasize, this is carved into golden or stone tablets. An acceptable random number generator must combine at least 2 ideally unrelated methods. So effectively you use 2 methods to generate random numbers and then you combine them in some way, like just multiply them together or something. The combination should be by simple operations, that's the way you combine them, that do not produce results less random than their operands. Things to note about this, the word acceptable. So again, it's not talking about a perfect world or ideal, the ideal random number generator. Having said you've got different applications will require different generators, an acceptable random number generator must combine at least 2 methods. So they're clearly thinking about the full range of applications when they say acceptable and must. And then if you don't want to read the rest of this section, then use the following code to generate all the uniform digits you'll ever need. And then what you see below, there's some code, and that's for a random number generator, which they call RAN, capital R-A-N. And they offer that as their recommendation. And then they describe that going over the page. So I'm now on page 148. And just above the heading, some history. In the rest of this section, we briefly review some history, the rise and fall of the LCG, then give details on some of the algorithmic methods that go into a good generator and how to combine those methods. Finally, we will give some further recommended generators additional to RAN above. So that comes later in the chapter. Then we have the history, and the history is basically, this is why you don't use LCGs in detail. So it starts off by saying, with hindsight, the whole field of random number generation was mesmerised for far too long by this equation, which is the LCG. And just for your reference, they define MLCG there. When C equals 0, you can call it an LCG and MLCG. And then at the top of page 149, the first paragraph, the idea of LCGs goes back to the dawn of computing, and they were widely used in the 1950s and thereafter. The trouble in paragraphs first began to be noticed in the mid-1960s, and then they give some mathematical explanation of what was seen and the problems that arose that were detected. Then the next paragraph begins, even worse, many early generators happened to make particularly bad choices for M&A. One infamous routine, Randu, was widespread on IBM mainframe computers for many years. And they go on to say how bad that was. Then the next paragraph, LCGs and MLCGs have additional weaknesses. And they go on to talk some more problems. The next paragraph, a lot of effort, talks about how people try to fix them. And the conclusion is, looking back, it seems clear that the field's long preoccupation with LCGs was somewhat misguided. There's no technological reason that the better non-LCG generators of the last decade could not have been discovered decades earlier, nor any reason the impossible dream of an elegant single algorithm generator could not have been abandoned much earlier in favour of the more pragmatic patchwork in combined generators. Note also the reference to pragmatic. As we will explain below, LCGs and MLCGs can still be useful, but only in carefully controlled situations with due attention to their manifest weaknesses. And now I promise to go back to the word principally in that bullet point.
Yes. We seem to be missing the bit where we get the explanation of when they're useful.
Right, so what I'm about to tell you. So, as is said in the bit, as is stated in the bit on page 148 of the bundle, just above some history, they go on to suggest some other generators which you can use. And these are all combined generators, of course. As is said in the box, you do combined generators. And they do include some generators where one bit of the generator is an LCG. So that explains why they say never use a generator principally based on an LCG. you can, if you're very, very careful, do a combined generator where one half or quarter or third of it is an LCG. So in the context of a combined generator, never use a generator principally based on an LCG. That's the point. There's no qualification to that bullet point, nor any qualification to the bullet point, never use a generator with a period less than 2 to the power 64.
So when they say at the bottom of 149, LCGs can still be useful, but only in carefully controlled situations, you say that means that only as part of a combined...
Yes, absolutely, that's exactly what it means.
Okay.
Well, that's clear from the box, because it says in the box an acceptable generator must, and then it's the history section. I mean, so
do we have the below in the bundles anywhere?
they were in the trial bundles. We went through them, but the judge didn't refer to them. The judge didn't say that there was anything in there that suggested you could use them. Again, if your lordships want to see them, you can see as much as you want. But I'll tell you the way it's structured is you've got lots of elemental algorithms, and then it suggests combine A and B, or why don't you combine E and F makes a good combination, or A, C, and G together make a good combination, and so on like that. That's how it works. So you saw the references to Nuth, and of course what they're sending you to Nuth for is principally section 3.5 on the philosophy. There is one part of Nuth that is highly relevant to the particular question that we're looking at in chapter 3, so that I should show you before making my submission. So that's the sup 2 bundle.
Well, just before you go to Nuth itself,
Yeah.
you've pointed out there's a reference to section 3.5. Is there, I mean, I can't see it in what we've got, but it could be in pages we don't have, a cross-reference to the section in Nuth that deals with LCGs.
No, I mean, chapter 3 has LCGs in it, but there's no reference to the chapter on LCGs. No, it's chapter 3, in particular 3.5.
Why, if numerical registers, this section tells you what is a good generator, general purpose generator, belt and braces, why do you go to Nuth at all?
Exactly. That's exactly our submission, my lord. It doesn't make any sense. The skilled person who got this far, they'd use RAM. Or perhaps they'd use one of the other generators later in the chapter. Exactly. The reason Professor Lozano did it, of course, is because he was reading a different version, which gives warnings about LCGs, but doesn't say don't use them, and even gives some quick and dirty generators. Actually, we've got the page from NRC2 that says quick and dirty generators. So that's why Professor Lozano went to it. We'll have to look at the judge's and we're going to look at the judge's reasoning in a moment. But I mean, our submission is it's just totally irrational. Somebody reading this would do that. And if they did, can I show your lordship what they would find of very great relevance in Nuth chapter 3? So this is the sup bundle. So it's internal page 173 of Nuth chapter 3. It's bundle page 177.
Sorry, are we in the first bundle or the second?
Second one.
Right.
So I'm on internal page 173. There's a paragraph beginning unfortunately. Unfortunately, quite a bit of published material in existence at the time this chapter was written recommends the use of generators that violate the suggestions above. the most common generation actually use randu is really horrible. You remember NRC 3 also called out randu as being problematic. The authors of many contributions to the science of random number generation were unaware that particular methods they were advocating would prove to be inadequate. Perhaps further research will show that even random number generators recommended here are unsatisfactory. We hope this is not the case, but the history of the subject warns us to be cautious. Now, I invite your lordships to read that sentence through the eyes of someone who's come here via NRC 3. They would say, oh dear, I'm sorry, Miss Dr. Knuth, but history has shown that your recommendations don't work. He's referring to the recommendations at the beginning of the chapter, which is a recommended LCG, which I'm coming to.
And this text is in the one that was published in 1997, is it? Doesn't sound like the kind of text that would have stayed the same when you republished an edition many years later.
Well, as I say, we said at trial it's unrealistic for the skilled person to go to chapter 2, to the second edition, because that's what Apple's case. Apple's case was built on NRC and then this chapter.
The only thing that existed from Knuth of chapter 3 is this.
At trial, yes, I will try and look at that paragraph. That is something that just hadn't occurred to me because we just proceeded throughout the trial on the basis that this was the same, because this is the chapter that they said you would be using. I mean, it was their case.
Yeah, but it was also their case that NRC2 would be what you would use, and you proved that was wrong. I'm a bit puzzled you didn't do the same thing with Knuth, but there we go. That's where we are.
Part of the problem is that we had to look at this second edition in great detail because they pleaded it, so we couldn't.
I don't see why it's at all a problem, even if it's pleaded prior art, for you to say this is nonsense. There's a later edition.
Well, we did, but we did is the answer.
All right.
And the judge was willing to treat this as being representative of the third edition. So the judgment. So this is the answer to my Lord Justice Nugee's question: why does the skilled person go to Knuth at all? That the judge deals with in he sums it up at paragraph 250 of this judgment. That's in the core bundle on page 112. So this 250 really sums up his finding that LCGs had much to commend them and had been widely used for a long time. And then he gave further reasons at 252 to 256, where he basically accepted Apple's case as to why NRC3
yes, but can you help us? Where does he deal specifically with going from NRC3 to the part of Knuth that deals with LCGs?
He doesn't, not in that way, because I think if he were here, he would say, well, the skilled person's already decided to use a random number generator. So once they're directed to Knuth, they go and look at the bit of Knuth that had to do with random number generators. But he doesn't deal with it like that at all. I mean, the reference to Knuth is just a reference to Knuth chapter 3 generally, with 3.5 in particular. So it is a flaw in this judgment that he's treating NRC 3 as being a direction to go to Knuth and look at LCGs when it does nothing of the sort. And that's a matter of construction of the document. So I'm now going to deal with the errors in paragraph 250 onwards, and most of these are properly regarded as errors of construction of NRC3. So if I can list our errors. Number one is the excessive reliance on Professor Lozano's evidence without taking into account that it's based on a false premise. And just to emphasise that it really was based on a false premise, I do need to show you what Professor Lozano said about NRC 3 versus NRC 2. That's in the first supplemental bundle, tab 13. bundle, page 151. So it's page 89. So it's sub bundle 1, tab 13, page 151 of the bundle.
Yeah.
Transcript reference, page 89. If your lordship could read from line 4 to 90, line 10. So Professor Lozano's skilled person, both in his report and orally, his conception of skilled person is someone who's using NRC2. And it's maybe it's understandable that with that in mind, he thought that LCGs would still be regarded as a potential option. The judge, of course, rejected that as a characteristic of the skilled person. But what the judge failed to do was take any of that into account when considering when assessing Professor Lozano's evidence. All the evidence that he accepted should have been completely reassessed in light of the fact that Professor Lozano was building his entire case on the wrong edition of NRC. Second complaint about paragraph 250 is just the lack of internal logic. So I'm back on paragraph 250 of the judgment. The fact that LCGs had been used for a long time can't be a factor in their favour when NRC3 had explained in patient and detailed terms why it was wrong that people used them for such a long time and the experience had shown them to be unsatisfactory. Apart from that, what on earth did LCGs have to commend them? That they were fast and easy to implement. With the greatest respect, that's like saying that bloodletting as a medical cure has much to commend it because it's fast, easy to do and being used for centuries. What matters is whether it's efficacious. And on that, NRC3 was absolutely clear and unqualified, and no rational person reading it will form the view that the judge does in paragraph 250. Third, now over the page in the judgment, the judge accepted Professor Lozano's claim that NRC3 was focused on the most demanding applications and that LCGs would be fine for less demanding applications. You can see that in 252, the third line. He said, I accept Professor Lozano's evidence that what is under consideration in NRC is demanding situations where very long sequences are needed. And you see it throughout the judgment, all the way up to 293. When he does his overall assessment, he refers to LCGs still known to be useful where the randomness needed was not too great. And I went through the parts of NRC3 that were relevant to that, and it's just simply not true that it's only focused on the most demanding application. Specifically talks about the full range of applications. It uses words like never when saying no to LCGs, and it uses the word acceptable when it's in the box.
Mr. Abrams, let me tell you what I understand the judge is doing in 252. You've taken us to the book and said, well, look at the book. It says basically never use them. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. But what the judge is doing in 252 is looking at what evidence the expert gave when those statements were put to him. And the expert said, taking judgment at face value, what the judge is recording the experts have said. So you can come to the Court of Appeal and say, well, he's wrong. But the judge had before him an expert who was saying those things to him.
Well, as I said, my first point was that he didn't reassess the expert's evidence in light of the way that the expert forms his evidence.
Well, why is that? Sorry, just a minute, but I don't understand why that's relevant, because as I understand what's going on in 252 is the professor is focusing on the very text you're relying on, giving his reasons why he thinks the skilled person's view of it would be what he says there.
Indeed, and I'm saying that this is. So just to be clear, I accept he's fairly summarising the expert's statements in the witness box there. So that's not the point. The point is that A, that's a misconstruction of the document. It's just not what the document says. Or B, it's just irrational and completely unsupportable that anybody could read the document and think that when it is clearly talking about and addressing itself to the full range of applications short of serious cryptographic use.
Is it a matter of construction of the document for a court? Isn't it a matter for expert evidence? There's a question of fact what a document teaches, isn't it?
I mean, we are. In my submission,
if it's not, tell me.
Clear. No, well, you sometimes there can be a grey area between where you talk about what the document says about construction and what it teaches and what would be understood. Here, we're miles from that grey area because in my submission, the document is absolutely clear beyond any sensible reading. And that's my submission, and it can't say more than never, must, acceptable, good enough. I mean, imagine if you wanted to rewrite NRC 3 to avoid this conclusion. I'm not sure how you would do it, because it's just as clear as it could be that it is considering the full range of
This is really a submission. The judge should have rejected that part of Professor Lozano's evidence.
Yes, either because the document says what the document says as a matter of construction, or because the professor's evidence was not capable of acceptance given the plain words of the document. And he could have said, I forgive Professor Lozano because Professor Lozano formed his view at the wrong document, is now with hindsight trying to hold on to his position when presented with a different document. So one can have some sympathy for Professor Lozano being guilty of confirmation bias and being guilty perhaps of ex post facto reasoning. But the point remains and can't be got away from that NRC 3 says what it says, and it absolutely says that LCGs cannot be used for any application in the context where they are considering the full range of applications short of serious cryptographic use. So I say my primary submission is this is a matter of construction, but if it's a matter of the judge accepting the witness's evidence, then I do not shrink at all from saying that the judge's conclusion on this was irrational. Fifth, this is closely related to the previous point. The fourth is, the third point. My third point was that NRC 3 clearly is talking about the full range of demandingness. The fourth point is that LCGs are not said to be okay for the lowest level of demandingness. It says they're not to be used for any such situations. And the fifth point is that the judge seemed to think that NRC 3's teaching was inapplicable because it was focused on long period lengths, longer than the skilled person would need. That's again, you see that in 252 when he refers to very long sequences of very random numbers are needed. And again, that's a plainly wrong reading of LCG, of NRC 3. The bullets, when they say never use an LCG, that's not pegged to the period length. The prohibition of using a period less than 2 times 10 to the 19 is a separate point to the prohibition on LCGs. And indeed, NRC 3 says the opposite of what the judge says. It says specifically you won't need very long period lengths. There's a minimum bound above which you just don't need to go. So it's saying the opposite. It's saying you've got to have at least 2 times 10 to the 19, but you don't need to go much higher. And it specifically says avoid RNGs for cryptographic use. Indeed, if you look at paragraph 254, he says that the skilled person bringing this understanding to bear on the problem presented by Ericsson would know that there are 65,000 UEIDs to be distributed randomly, and that was vastly lower than the scales relevant to cryptography, etc. But NRC3 is avoiding cryptography applications. So why is he distinguishing this problem from cryptography?
As an aside,
Yes.
where does the number 65,000 come from?
So it's a 16, the UEID is 16 bits long, and so
yes.
it's approximately
2 to 16.
Yes. Just finally on this point, of course, the section on the history of LCGs, going through all their weaknesses in detail, never mentions their period as being one of their weaknesses. That was never the problem with LCGs. Sixth point. This.
Sorry, Mr. Rivers, I don't understand what you mean by to say that. I mean, I understand what you mean when you say periods weren't the problem for LCGs, but I don't understand why that matters.
Well, because the judge rejects the teaching in NRC3 in 252 inter alia on the basis that NRC3 is focused on very long period lengths, and the implication being, therefore, if I'm not worried about a long period length, then I can use an LCG. That's the implication from the first half of 252.
What is the problem with LCGs?
They're not random enough.
They produce patterns.
Yeah. I mean, it's described in quite mathematical terms in that history section of NRC3. That's the best explanation in the papers for why they're not very good. Yeah, I suppose that ultimately a random number generator either doesn't produce good patterns or it does. Excuse me, either produces good random numbers or it produces patterns. The sixth point is that this section of the judge's judgment is inconsistent with the concept of a skilled person who hadn't heard of LCGs before and has never done making their own random number generator. So they're not the sort of person who is able to bring their own experience to bear on the unequivocal teaching of NRC3. Some professor of mathematics who'd made 100 RNGs might be in a position to say, well, I know more than people of NRC3, but the skilled person is learning about LCGs for the first time. Seventh, the judge's conclusion on NRC3 contradicts the premise. In this sense, Apple and Professor Lozano's whole case was built on the skilled person looking in NRC3 for random number generators. They're doing that because they expect to find material relevant to them in it. I showed your lordships all the passages where Professor Lozano said, you go to numerical recipes in C because that's the go-to source, the primary reference. It's completely logical for the skilled person, having done that, to then say, oh, hang on, this isn't relevant to me. Not based on anything in the book, but based on some other knowledge which the skilled person just doesn't have. My eighth point comes at this from a different angle. I've been addressing your lordships on the point that on this concept that NRC3 is aimed at more demanding applications. But there's no basis for saying that the application facing the skilled person, improving the Ericsson function, was an undemanding application. Now again, I have to face up to the fact that Professor Lozano said that the Ericsson function task was a less demanding application. That's recorded at the end of 252. I'm not shrinking away from the fact that Professor Lozano said that. But that made no sense other than as an ex post facto attempt to justify ignoring the teaching of NRC 3. The facts were that the Ericsson function was the product of collaborative discussion and consensus at the round 1 meeting. But despite expectations, it had turned out to provide insufficient randomness. And the skilled person on this hypothesis is looking at NRC 3 for the purpose of creating a new function that would have more randomness than the Ericsson function was able to provide. So on what basis could the skilled person conclude that this was an undemanding application when the whole of round 1 had so far failed to come up with a sufficiently random function? For what it's worth, Professor Lozano had never claimed in his written evidence that the Ericsson function was an undemanding application. This was something he came up with in the box when he was confronted with NRC 3. Again, it's relevant here that the judge made findings that the skilled person had never before heard of an LCG. So how can they, skilled person, based on no CGK and what they read in NRC 3, conclude that the Ericsson function was less demanding than anything being talked about here?
I suppose you can say that that's an indication of hindsight. Knowing we know what we know now, that LCG is the answer, that tells you it's not as demanding as you might have thought it was, but that's obviously hindsight.
That's what's written, right? That's literally what I was about to say, my lord.
Well, there you go. I'll take a share of your brief fee.
Yes, absolutely, my lord. Just bank details. We know that LCGs work because we've got 4G mobile phones that work beautifully. Professor Lozano didn't. Excuse me, the skilled person didn't. Professor Lozano did. So those are my submissions on steps 5 and 6. It's really step 6. This idea that it would be anything other than completely irrational to decide that an LCG is the solution to the problem.
You told us this morning that the inventor didn't use this step method to get to the answer.
Yes.
Do we know how the inventor got to the answer?
Yes.
Is it of any relevance?
Again, not really, because of what in technical, we're going to come to technograph. In technograph, they say I remind myself, Lord Diplock says even if the defendant's step-by-step route does mimic the inventor's, it still can be inventive. We know because LG presented their idea to round 1 in a series of what we call T-docs, which are these technical documents that present solutions to the working groups, and I can give you we can provide that. That was obviously gone into at trial. LG knew about LCGs from the beginning. You can see they start off with LCGs, so that's an aspect of common general knowledge that the skilled person wouldn't have, that they had. They didn't split up the Ericsson function in the way that this does. There was certainly no reference to NRC or NUF or going via that. And we know they explain how they selected the parameters. Parameter A, they did select in the way that Professor Lozano said the skilled person would select it, because we say that that's where he got it from, but never mind. D, they did by simulations. We're going to see in a minute that Professor Lozano's route has D selected via some theory, whereas we know that LG selected it via doing simulations on A and D. So again, if your lordships want those documents, there were 3 documents actually, and they were called LGE1, LGE2, and LGE3 at trial, and they were the documents where they were presented.
Yeah, the problem is you then need all the evidence relating to that. So
Indeed.
Unless it's essential, I think we're probably better off without.
No, well, that's why.
Hence my question as to whether it's relevant, because it's not actually relevant how inventive or clever the invention was. What's relevant is whether it would have been obvious to us.
Indeed. And the only reason I do this is because I wouldn't want your lordships to think something weird is going on when I say it's irrational to do what Professor Lozano did, because that doesn't mean that what the inventors did was irrational. The inventors were doing something completely different.
But they didn't go to NRC 3rd edition and say, nevertheless, we're going to use an LR.
That I think is common ground, yes. Or maybe it's not. Well, anyway, there's no suggestion. There's no suggestion, and we do have the documents where they certainly don't mention NRC 3 or NUF. So those are my submissions on step 6. And I'm now moving on to step 7. And step 7 is somewhat of a reprise of step 2, but you'll see why it's necessary to consider it here. And this is the subject of ground 3E. So at step 7, we're assuming that the skilled person has ignored all the dire warnings against using an LCG in NRC3, and they've decided that an LCG is what they need to provide a sequence of random numbers, and they're reading NOOF for that purpose. And in that context, they have to consider the way in which the output of the LCG is to be scaled to a number between 0 and C minus 1. Now, NOOF teaches how to do that. It teaches how to take the output of an LCG and scale it to a range. And so that is in the supplemental bundle at internal page 114. So it's really in section 3.4.1 under the heading A, random choice from a finite set. And you can see it's talking about the simplest and most common type of distribution required in practice is a random integer. And that's exactly what we want, or what our skilled person wants. He wants a random integer between 0 and C minus 1 inclusive. Now, Knuth explains how to do this in quite compressed mathematical language. But there's no dispute about what this means because the judge explained it. So rather than walking through this text, I'm just going to show you where the judge explained it. It's in the judgment, paragraph 268. It's the 268 at the end. The alternative is to convert the output of the LCG to a number between 0 and 1 by dividing the modulus of the LCG, multiplying by C, and taking the integer part. The judge doesn't there say that's what's taught in 3.4.1. So just to close the circle, I'll give you the reference to Professor Lozano saying that's what 3.4.1 is teaching. It's in the supplemental bundle at tab 14, page 168. It's page 262. Was it 263? Sorry, I've got a bad reference. I wasn't proposing to go to it because I don't think this is controversial. But unfortunately my reference is wrong, I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry, it's 263, lines 6 to 12, where I put to him that that is what is being taught on page 114, and he agreed. So that was a rather complicated way of telling the lordships that Knuth teaches that the way to convert the output of an LCG to a number to a range of integers is to divide by the modulus and then multiply by C or K on page 114 it's called. Now, if your lordships have page 268, paragraph 268 of the judgment.
So, presumably, if you had a string of binary number, a long binary number, if you were to make a modulus which was 16, you just ignore all the bits beyond 16. That's how you would do a modulus. It's very simple.
Correct.
But if you, and so what you end up with, if you take that approach, the remainder is the first, however many bits that is, 4 or 5, I can't remember, it doesn't matter. Right. But if you divide the whole number by the modulus, then the most significant, the bits away on the left are going to be the ones that tell you roughly what the answer is going to be, not the ones on the far right.
Well, it's even easier because what it's even easier than that, because what Knuth is saying is that if you want a whole number, you just take the so many bits on the left-hand side and ignore the rest, which is effectively by dividing
Right,
by
I see.
that
Yes,
number.
it's the other way around. I see. Yes.
It is the other way around. You just take the left-hand load of bits. So that's what they're saying. That's what they're saying here on page 114. An integer between 0 and 7 can be extracted from 3 bits of u on a binary computer. In such a case, these bits should be extracted from the most significant left-hand part of the computer word. So you just take the 3 left-hand
Yes.
bits.
Which is like the opposite of the modulus in a way.
Yeah, in a way. And then you've got 0 to 7.
Can you explain
Yes.
the remainder of that sentence? Since the least significant bits at the right-hand end, are not sufficiently random. Why not?
Okay. So
That's where you get the patterns.
Yeah, we're coming to this. One of the recognised problems with LCGs is that the right hand, the least significant bits, the right hand bits, were not sufficiently random, and we're now hitting that point. The Knuth also teaches you a way of avoiding that problem with LCGs. But it is a fact that a general problem with LCGs was that often the right-hand bits were insufficiently random. Do you recall in NRC 3 we saw a bullet point which said never use a generator that warns against using its lower order bits as being completely random?
Yes.
Yeah. So, and it went on to say that was good advice once, because in the days when LCGs were regarded as usable, you still had to be careful not to use the right-hand bits. Now we're in a world where LCGs are not usable at all. If you see that warning, you know that you must keep clear of that random number generator completely.
This bit of Knuth says you can use the left hand bit, so this isn't a problem.
This particular problem isn't a problem. I mean, that wasn't the only problem with LCGs. But you can't, of course, you can't use the mod. So this says use the left-hand bits.
Yes, but then, as you say, you don't use the mod.
Then you
function.
don't use the mod function. So Apple have to. The problem for Apple is Knuth tells you to use the left-hand bits, but to get within the invention, we need the skilled person to use the mod function on the right-hand bits, and that's what the point I'm addressing. So, in short, our skilled person, they've got to Knuth, and they're using Knuth to do an LCG. They read this, they go, okay, I'll do this method to scale the output of my LCG between 0 and C minus 1. That's what Knuth is telling me to do. And they don't get within claim 1, because they won't use mod C. So, another reason why the chain falls to pieces. Now I need to deal with what the judge said about this. The way the judge dealt with it in 268 was to present the two as being alternatives. So I'll come on to 269 and 270 in a moment, but at 268 he's already making an error because he's treating these two things, mod C or the Knuth method, I'm going to call it, the Knuth section 3.4.1 method. He's treating them as alternatives when the hypothesis is the skilled person is reading Knuth and they're taught one to use. So either the judge has failed to take into account Knuth's teaching at this stage, or he's misconstrued Knuth. Then at 269, he says this: Knuth explains at 3.2.1.1 that the problem of low randomness right-hand bits arises in particular with a modulus that is a power of 2 and is avoided with a modulus which is prime and of the form 2n plus 1. Okay, so I accept that Knuth says that. Okay. Then he says, so the skilled person who's read Knuth would not think there was any general problem with using mod C provided care was taken. That doesn't follow. Knuth never suggests in 3.2.1.1 or anywhere that the upshot is sometimes it's okay to use the right-hand bits or mod operation. Section 3.4.1 does not say this is the method to use only where there may be an issue with the lower bits. It says that this is what you should do, full stop.
No, but in 3.4.1, Knuth does say, doesn't it? The problem is the low order bits may not be sufficiently random, and in 3.2.1.1 says this isn't a problem with plus 2 to the n plus or minus 1.
No, but remember two things. First of all, that Knuth never then says, therefore, feel free to use mod C in those situations. Knuth just says, this is what you should do. And remember, my lord, that our skilled person reading Knuth has never heard of LCGs before they read NRC3. They've never made their own random number generator. This is the first time they've ever had to think about the question, how do I scale the output of a random number generator to the integer range? And in that context, they're not presented with two alternatives to choose from, as the judge presents the question in 268. They are told, this is what you should do. The judge's approach, I would suggest, is based on a presumption in favour of the mod C operation, because
that bit works perfectly well.
Except it doesn't, but yes, your logic's got the point. This is why step 2 is so pernicious. They need to bank the mod C at an early stage, so that when they come to this, mod C is already in the bank, and they can say, oh, no, don't worry, I've got an answer to this, I've got an excuse. But of course, that's not how things work in real life. A skilled person who's never done an LCG, never scaled the output of an LCG, reads what they're told in Knuth to do. If you read it with an open mind, there is only one answer. And that's why we say this section is flawed. Your Lordship, sorry, my Lords, I referred earlier to, when I was in the context of step 2, to paragraph 270, which is where the judge acknowledges that there are instances where mod C is suboptimal. And now your Lordships understand why there are instances where mod C is suboptimal. Mod C is suboptimal when you're using an LCG. The right-hand bits are less random. But paragraph 270 exposes now why step 2 is so unrealistic, because we know that mod C, we definitely know mod C doesn't work all the time. And yet step 2 requires the skilled person to bank that as a fixed element. So I'm just hopefully my submission I made earlier about paragraph 270 in step 2 makes more sense now. My Lord, I'm now, if you're ready, going to move on to step 8. And step 8, we're now moving on to claim 4. And this is the subject of ground 7. And so here the complaint is that the judge has the skilled person embarking on producing a bespoke LCG rather than an off-the-shelf solution, or as we'll see, you'll see what I mean by off-the-shelf solution. So if you've got Knuth, the section on LCGs, I showed you the beginning of it. It starts on page 9. And just turning the pages and looking at the headings, on page 11 you've got a section on choice of modulus, including this table, and then on page 15 you've got a section on choice of multiplier, and then you've got lots of maths, and then you've got lots of material which the skilled person is faced with. But then, on page 170, there's a convenient summary. So the first paragraph says we've covered a fairly large number of topics in this chapter: how to generate random numbers, how to test them, how to modify them in applications, how to derive theoretical facts about them. Perhaps the main question in many readers' minds will be, what is the result of all this theory? What is a simple virtuous generator I can use in my programs in order to have a reliable source of random numbers? Now, the skilled person who's come this far would be thinking exactly in those terms, and I put that to Professor Lozano, and he agreed readily that the skilled person would be thinking in exactly those terms. Your Lordships want the reference. It's tab 14, bundle page 163, transcript page 237, lines 14 to 21. Second paragraph recommends an LCG, and we're assuming the skilled person is ignoring the teaching in NRC 3. But I draw your attention to the warning at the end of that paragraph. It is necessary to choose X naught, A, C, and M properly, and to use the random numbers wisely according to the following principles. So that's a warning to be careful, and again, to a person who's never done this before. So point 1 teaches about the seed. Seed number may be chosen arbitrarily. Point 2 is about the modulus. They say the number M should be large, say at least 2 to the 30, may conveniently be taken as the computer's word size, since that makes computation quite efficient. Point 3 is information about the multiplier. Point 4 is more on the multiplier. Point 5 is about the increment. They say it doesn't really matter. You can use an increment of 1 or equal to the multiplier. Point 6 teaches you how to scale the output to integer values in a particular range. So that's the same teaching that we saw in 3.4.1 repeated in the summary. So everything I said earlier about 3.4.1 I say about this. And I draw particular attention to the words should always be influenced. So this isn't an alternative as the judge treated it in his 268 to 270. Should always is the teaching of Knuth to a person who's never done this before. And then point 7 says that this approach might not work for more demanding applications, effectively. So you certainly can't reject this teaching on the basis that it's not applicable to less demanding applications. But to get within, sorry, go back. I call this an off-the-shelf solution. I mean, this still requires the skilled person to do a bit of work and make some choices. But for the purposes of my shorthand, when I say off-the-shelf, I include this very clear and neat guidance as to how to choose the parameters. To get within claim 4 of the patent, Apple and Professor Lozano needed the skilled person to ignore all of this teaching. I should be clear that the first sentence of point 4 is consistent with claim 4 of the patent. A is between 100th and 9900ths of the modulus. Apart from that sentence, if the skilled person uses any part of this teaching, then they will not get into claim 4. So Apple's case has to have the skilled person ignore practically every word of this summary and select their own wholly different parameters for their new LCG. Not something they've ever done before, not something they need to do before. There's no reason for them to do that rather than just do this. And remember that the skilled person who's come this far has come via NRC 3 with all its warnings about choosing the values correctly. I mean, it's got prohibition, but it also talks about, rando, which this document itself also says is pretty horrible. So they know that you have to be very, very careful about selecting the parameters. Otherwise, things can go horribly wrong.
So, this may not be a question for you, but I'm still struggling as to what it is said, or what on the judge's reasoning, the skilled person gets out of Nuth. Because if you've read NRC3, you know about LCGs. I mean, your case is with a major health warning not to use them, but leave that aside for a moment. You know of the existence of LCGs. So what is the skilled person getting out of Nuth? I mean, your case, I understand, is, well, they're not getting anything helpful out of 3.6 because 3.6 doesn't lead them to the answers in Claim 4. What does the skilled person get out of Nuth that takes them towards the invention?
I think it will be said that Nuth promotes LCGs in a way that makes them look attractive. Of course, our point on that is you know that Nuth is out of date in that respect. And NRC3 is explaining carefully. Secondly, they need Nuth because their way of getting the parameters for Claim 4, they delve into the earlier sections that I looked at, that I showed you. When I took you through the section 3.2.1, that section on LCGs, they need to go there and extract some teaching to get particularly the multiplier.
Right, okay.
So I think those are the two answers that they would give. And I think they would also, maybe the increment as well, the increment in Claim 4 is 0. They would say they get that from Nuth. We don't complain about that. They don't get the multiplier from Nuth. They just do simulations to get the multiplier.
Okay, thank you.
Multiplier increment is 0. Yeah. Yes. No, I got that right. Now, the judge, insofar as the judge dealt with the point that I'm making, he dealt with that at paragraphs 112 to 117, with his conclusion at 117. This I've already shown you. This is the heading, Experience of RNGs / LCGs, which I already showed you. And his conclusion is, I reject the argument that the skilled person would be someone who did not understand that what they were doing with RNGs and or thereby lack confidence, so they only used off-the-shelf solutions. That doesn't really hit the point as to why is the skilled person not following all the warnings about the need for great care in choosing parameters. What's the motivation for doing a bespoke LCG at all when you've got everything handed to you on a plate in section 3.6? Just doesn't address that. And it remains the case on his factual findings that the skilled person has never done this before. And I need to be fair and show your lordships paragraph 300, where the judge mentioned section 3.6. That just simply doesn't grapple with the question, why on earth would the skilled person want to create their own bespoke LCG when they don't need to and they've got everything handed on the plate and they've never done it before? And again, Professor Lozano ignored section 3.6 altogether because his evidence was focused on pages 1 to 40, which is what was pleaded by Apple. There was no mention of it in his reports, and the judge should have very seriously reassessed Professor Lozano's evidence about what the skilled person would do in light of the fact that he hadn't considered the summary. So Professor Lozano's evidence just goes straight to, right now I start selecting the parameters. He didn't go through the stage of considering, is the skilled person going to select their own parameters, make their own bespoke LCG, or are they going to use this off-the-shelf solution that's presented on one plate? It just wasn't part of his reasoning, and the judge just didn't factor that into his assessment, and that is a failure to take into account a highly material matter. So that is step 8. I'm now going to step 8. Step 9 is the selection of the increment, b equals 0, and I'm not making any submissions on that. If I lose on everything else, I'm not going to win on step 9. Step 10 is selecting the modulus d equals 65537. On that, if I can start with what the judge said, the judge summarised Professor Lozano's evidence at paragraph 304 of the judgment. So 304, and then he essentially accepted that. Now, at trial, we relied on many reasons why d equals 65537 is illogical and unrealistic for a skilled person who's come to an LCG on this route. And in this court, we're just going to focus on our best point, and that's ground 7A. So step 10, our complaint is ground 7A. And this relates to paragraph 310 of the judgment, where the judge rejected our point that the skilled person would want a much larger modulus than 65537. And we say he was plainly wrong to do so. Plainly wrong not to accept that 65537 is not obvious to a person who's come this particular route to an LCG. So, in relation to that, first, even before the skilled person got to Nuth, they'd been told by NRC that the period of any random number generator, and I do mean any, should be at least about 2 to the power 64 or 2 times 10 to the power 19. We saw that in the bullet points. Second, this is 655337 is inconsistent with Nuth's teaching in this respect. So if we go back to Nuth chapter 3 in the supplemental bundle, and this time go to internal page 11. Firstly, at page 11, under choice of modulus, the third sentence says, we want the modulus to be rather large, since the period cannot have more than m elements.
I'm sorry, did you say chapter 3?
Sorry, chapter 3, so that's supplemental bundle 2. Internal page 11, page 15 of the bundle. But under the heading choice of modulus, we want m to be rather large, since the period cannot have more than m elements. Then, going on to internal page 15, under the heading of choice of multiplier, in this section we now how to choose the multiplier A so as to give the period of maximum length. So they're focusing on the period here. A long period is essential for any sequence that is to be used as a source of random numbers. Indeed, we would hope that the period contains considerably more numbers than would ever be used in a single application. And here you've got up to 65,535 UEs, each generating 10 random numbers. And then you've seen this already, but on page 170, in the summary.
Quite the same thing as period, though, is it?
So if you want a period, the modulus has to be at least as big as the period. Mm-hmm. So a teaching that the period must be.
No, but the number of UEs isn't related in a simple way to the period, because you're only, in terms of period, you're only going to run it for 10 runs.
No, indeed, but what they say is that long period is essential for any sequence that is to be used as a source of random numbers. Indeed, we'd hope the period contains considerably more numbers than will ever be used in a single application. So that's what this is generating. This LCG is generating numbers for all of those UEs. In any case, anyway, they put flesh on the bones on page 170, where they say it should be large, say at least 2 to the power 30. So that's page 170, little Roman 2.
Sorry, we're still in Newth, are we?
Yeah.
Page 170. Right.
Page 170.
Oh, this is your summary bit.
Yeah. So Newth says that the modulus should be at least 2 to the 30, and NRC 3 says the period, and therefore the modulus, should be at least 2 to 64. So far, far higher than 65,537, which is 2 to the 16 minus 1, plus 1. Now the judge dealt with this at 310, as I said, and effectively he's referring back to his finding that the amount of randomness must depend on the application. And I've made my submissions on that. There's just no basis for the skilled person with the CGK that we've discussed who's come this way, in this route, would think that the Ericsson function, that these rules don't apply to the Ericsson function. On the contrary, they've come here because the Ericsson function didn't have enough randomness. They're looking for something more random. And please don't forget the warnings that I showed you in NRC3 and in Newth itself about the need to choose the parameters with care. Otherwise, things can go horribly wrong. That was horribly wrong was how they described that Randu implementation used by IBM, with presumably no slouches. So it's just not rational for a skilled person to think I can ignore these mandatory teachings in both Newth and NRC3 that the period should be either 2 to the 30 or 2 to the 64, depending on which one you're going to. And and I was going to repeat the point that my Lord Justice Birss jumped in with. We know, of course, that 65537 is a completely sensible decision because we watch YouTube videos very satisfactorily on our 4G phones or whatever. It's used in literally billions of 4G phones. But the question for the judge was whether a skilled person who'd never come across LCGs before and had never selected a modulus for an LCG in their life and who had learnt about periods and moduluses from NRC3 and Newth would have seen that 65537 could be made to work without hindsight. And the answer is obviously no. That's the only rational answer to that question. And that's the answer to, just for completeness, that's the answer to the judge's paragraphs 313 and 314. .313 and 314, he's basically saying that 65537 is a sensible choice. I completely agree it's a sensible choice. It's not the question.
Why isn't it sensible? If its critical property is it's an easy prime number because it's a power of 2 plus or minus 1, and it's the first one you get bigger than the number of UIDs, and that means since you know that the number of sequences you're going to ever need is the number of UIDs, you know because it'll be a random sequence for the whole period that you will have a set of random sequences which are not repeating one with respect to the other. Is all you need.
Well, your Lordship has explained why it's a sensible number. And I agree it's a sensible number. But that's not something that you get without hindsight if you're a skilled person who's got to where we are now by the route that they've got to. And we rely on we rely on the point about the period length. That's the clearest demonstration of that. That's the one we go to. That's the one we hang our wigs on. Because if you've come by this way, you have been told in mandatory terms that it should be 2 to the 30 or 2 to the 64, depending on which book you're reading. And you are not somebody who's ever done this before, who can say, I know better than Newth and the authors of NRC3.
What do you get from table 1 on page 13 now?
So there was a separate point about the argument that you would use a value of 2n plus or minus 1. So at trial, Nuth says you can use the word size of the computer or the word size plus or minus 1. Professor Lozano generalised that and said, well, that means you can use any value of 2 to the power n or 2 to the power n plus or minus 1. And here, look, they are on the table. Having considered it, that's not a point we think is going to appeal to your lordships. It's not a court of appeal point, if I may say that. So we are not challenging the judge's findings, which revolve around table 1, page 13. We're simply attacking a completely separate point, which is his rejection of our submission that the skilled person would never go below 2 to the 30 or 2 to the 64 for their modulus. It's a long-winded way of saying I'm not challenging a bit of the judge's judgment that's founded on that. I'm now coming to step 11. Step 11 was the subject of ground 7b. On reflection, we don't think we can complain about the final conclusion on this step. If we've lost on 1 to 10, steps 1 to 10, we don't think we can complain about step 11. But the point that we made in relation to step 11, I will be raising in the context of ground 6, which is the overall assessment of the steps. And just to tell you what it is, it's this point that Professor Lozano was found reasoning backwards from the patent because he used a metric called max hits in relation to step 11. But because he came up with some other reasons for step 11, we don't think we can challenge the judge's overall conclusion on step 11. So those are the steps, and I've dealt with all the grounds in that context. I've dealt with all the grounds of appeal other than ground 6. Would now be a convenient moment for you to just do the concordance of grounds and steps.
Yes.
So let me just, that is, yeah. So grounds 1 and 4 relate to step 3. Ground 2 relates to claim 1 generally. Ground 3 relates to step 2, but also comes in at steps 7 and 4. Ground 3E comes in at steps 7 and 4. Ground 4 relates to steps 4 and 5. Ground 5 relates to steps 5 and 6. Ground 6 relates to the steps generally, and I'm going to do that. Ground 7 relates to steps 8 to 11, the specified claims generally. A is particularly focused on step 10, and B is particularly focused on step 11. Now, I won't. All I've got to do is ground 6. I won't finish ground 6 in the next 15 minutes, but I'll presume you'd rather I start it now and finish it tomorrow, my lord. Yeah. So this is where technograph is most pertinent. And your lordships wanted to see the usher. And I suggest your lordships put it in the. Oh, if you, I don't have a tab 5, just put it in the back of the authorities bundle.
Yep.
And the famous part is Lord Diplock at page 362, line 34. And I wouldn't attempt to summarise this. All I would say is that this applies with precision to the steps in this case. That's by Apple, accepted by the judge. Now, again, I have to acknowledge that the judge did say that he was standing back and considering the steps as a whole in paragraphs 196 and 296. For the purposes of ground 6, we point to 4 specific failings by the judge to do that job in the way it ought to have been done. These are 4 very clear problems with Apple's chain of steps, which the judge failed to see and failed to deal with. And the first relates to max 6. So this is a point, it's in our grounds of appeal, ground 7b, but I'm advancing it under the heading of ground 6. And this relates to Professor Lozano's evidence at, so this is a supplemental bundle, tab 8, page 118. So, but if we start at 117, you see at 117 you've got the skilled person would then turn to choosing values of the parameters equals an MA and C. I made the submission earlier that Professor Lozano never considered not doing a bespoke LCG, and this is where he failed to consider doing a bespoke LCG. Then at 217, the professor says, having arrived at values for M and C, the skilled person would then choose a value of A. Lowercase a is also capital A in Claim 4 and Claim 1. The skilled person would have undertaken routine simulations to find values of A, together with the other chosen parameter values that result in the desired properties. This would involve calculating the number of hits for all UAID pairs and for all values of C to identify a suitable choice of A. That choice would be based on maximum number of hits and possibly other criteria. So he's saying that the simulations would be, the principal criteria would be maximum number of hits, and there might be other criteria. Maximum number of hits we also called max hits for short at trial. This was a criterion introduced by the patent, and the judge's findings about it are in the core bundle. So that's tab 6, page 94. So at 143, he's narrating the patent and he explains the criteria of max hits. It's the maximum number of hits you get between any two UEIDs using a particular set of parameters. And then at 140 to 141, he addresses it as a matter of CGK. And he accepts that max hits is not a CGK criterion. Performing simulations with CGK, and they'd have to choose appropriate metrics, but they wouldn't know of max hits as a matter of CGK. I mean, just dealing with the end of that paragraph, I mean, max hits obviously is a suitable metric, since it's the metric that Professor Lozano put forward as being the one he wants the skilled person to use. But Professor Lozano hadn't suggested that max hits was CGK, and nor did he suggest it was an obvious thing to think of using. I asked him about this specifically, and in case there's any debate about it, I should show you what he said precisely. So that's in the supplemental bundle, tab 14, bundle page 167. So transcript page 259, lines 20 to 24. Of course, you and I know about the criterion of maximum number of hits because we've read LG's T-docs and the patents, that should say. But the skilled person at the priority date would not have known of the criteria of maximum hits. He could have thought about it, or maybe not, I do not know. So he's not suggesting that it was an obvious thing. So it's clear beyond argument that when Professor Lozano said in his paragraph 217 that the skilled person would be using max hits as the primary or only criterion, he can only have been working backwards from the patent. He can't have been he wasn't basing it on anything that he thought existed in the CGK. Now, just to be clear, Professor Lozano came back in his third report with a completely different justification for choosing that value of A. And I can't challenge, the judge accepted that alternative method, and that's why I can't challenge the choice of A. But paragraph 217 remained, on the judge's findings and the professor's own evidence, a clear instance of the professor reasoning backwards from the patent. He was caught with his hand in the cookie jar. And the judge simply ignored this. The judge should have recognised that this was a chain of steps constructed by a person with an eye on the patent. And he just failed to recognise it or deal with it.
Do we need to know what the max hits metric measures?
Well, it's summarised in the judgment in paragraph 143, but I mean the real answer is no, because, as I say, the judge found it wasn't CGK, and Professor Lozano wasn't saying it was CGK. So it was taken from the patent. That's the only place that Professor Lozano could have got it from. It is, in short, the maximum number of hits you get between any two UIDs using your set of set of parameters that you're testing out in your simulation.
Do you want it to be as low as possible?
Yes, I want it to be as low as possible. Across 10 frames, so it's a number between 0 to 10. Across 10 frames at a particular, across 10 subframes at one aggregation level. So you want it to be 0 and you don't want it to be 10. So the judge's failure to see that this was a chain, that we'd caught him red-handed, and that this was therefore a chain of steps constructed by a person reasoning back from the patent with an eye on the patent. That was the judge's first error. The second point we make under ground 6.
Can you just help me on the logic of that? You accept that in his third report, Professor Lozano came up with a different method of getting A.
Yes.
And you say, accept that you can't challenge the judge's conclusion with regard to that different method of getting A.
Yes.
So how then is the first method that Professor Lozano used relevant?
Well, it's relevant because it shows that he had an eye on the patent when constructing his steps. That paragraph 217, it appears in the section of his report. Can I go to it just to show you? Because that's the next point I was going to make. If you go to the supplemental bundle tab 10,
but
tab 8,
having an eye on the patent is not impermissible in itself.
No, but he was reasoning. He was reasoning back from the patent. He was saying this is a step that the skilled person would take, and the only justification for that step that could have been existing in his mind was because it's in the patent, because he didn't think that it was CGK. In a sense, it's more important what he thought. If he had said, I think this is CGK, but the judge had said not, then this point would have less force. But because even he didn't think it was CGK, then he can only have got the idea of max hits from the patent. So in his 217, he was clearly using the patent to get from Ericsson to a patent. And the judge, one can imagine a judgment where the judge recognised this and explains it away and says, for example, this was a momentary slip.
All right, but can I put this debate in a very different way to see if this is what you're saying? I mean, this strikes me as a variant of the sequential unblinding problem. But I don't see that mentioned anywhere in the judgment. It doesn't seem to have been a criticism advanced at trial that the method of instruction of Professor Lozano was deficient because he wasn't shown the prior art, asked what was obvious from the basis of that, and then shown the patent, and so on.
Indeed.
And of course, we all know that that's counsel of perfection, and sometimes you just can't do it for various reasons. And even if you don't do it, that's not the end of the story, and so on and so forth. But there's no trace in the judgment of that debate at all, which suggests to me that the submission simply wasn't made.
To all intents and purposes, it wasn't made. We did talk about whether he knew about the standard, and the judge dealt with that briefly in one paragraph. But
you see, if you're not saying that the expert was wrongly instructed because he wasn't subjected to sequential unblinding, then where does this take you? Well, because you're then left with the position is that there's nothing wrong with the fact that he knew about the patent. So then where do you?
Well, there's nothing wrong with the so I'm not complaining that he knew about the patent when he wrote this section. What I am complaining about is that he deliberately extracted not information from the patent to justify the chain of steps to get to the patent. So to justify getting from Ericsson to claim 1, he said you would use max hits, and he must have taken that consciously taken that from the patent, because he didn't think that it could come from anywhere else. And that judge should have grappled with that.
So in other words, your submission is it still demonstrates application of hindsight.
Yes, and that's what I used to phrase caught with his hand in the cookie jar, because this was an instance where, in many occasions, we accused him of hindsight, but this was an occasion where hindsight couldn't be denied, because where else did max hits come from if not the patent?
Was it put to him? Did you put it to him that you've been caught with your hands in the cookie jar? Or was to that effect?
I certainly put to him that he was using hindsight throughout.
Did he have a response on this particular aspect of it?
I will check. I mean, as I say,
I really hesitate to stand up, but I think the relevant bit of the transcript is page 258 to 259 on page 167 of the bundle.
Thank you.
So starting at line 24 of page 258.
Yes, no, my learned friend is right. I did say at the bottom of 258, you must be talking here about a person who has read the patent. This is so 258 line 12, I'm on paragraph 217, and I'm talking about the choice of the value of A, so we're on this topic. And I said to him, you must be talking here about a person who's read the patent. Because you mentioned maximum hits.
All right. Well, I think we'd better leave it there, and we'll resume at 10:32.